Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Martin Daunton.
Well, thank you, Martin, for that very generous introduction. I think that everybody in the hall and indeed online will be aware of all the problems that we have at the moment with water and sewage. Let me just list some of the issues that we have. There's been a failure to invest in maintaining the infrastructure of water supply and sewers. Surfers Against Sewage and campaigners have argued against the excessive discharge of raw sewage into our seas and rivers. Thames Water was fined £104 million last August for discharges, and then another £18.2 million last December for paying unjustified dividends. There's a financial problem. In March 2024, shareholders in Thames Water refused to provide half £500 million to stabilise finance because of a lack of agreement with the Office of the Water Regulator. They eventually negotiated a loan of £3 billion last October to pay senior creditors 9.75% to keep afloat into March 2025. That crisis is not over. As I speak, the courts are hearing a challenge from junior creditors who say that payment of interest is predatory. So Thames Water might run out of money, and the government is exploring a so-called special administrative regime to take over the water company in the short term. In December, water companies were granted permission to raise their prices in Thames Water by about a third by 2030. They had asked for an increase by 59%. So I could go on. Things have become very serious. And what I want to do in this lecture, because I'm an economic historian, is to provide a historical background and ask, did the Victorians do it better in terms of collective action as against private markets? Let me start off by stepping back, though, a little bit to look at some concepts to help us organise how we think about these issues. And I want to pick up three concepts. The first is natural monopolies. Utilities, such as water or gas, are natural monopolies. That is, they have a very high initial capital investment, but each additional consumer doesn't cost very much. There's a very low marginal cost. So if suppliers are competing, then there's a danger that the price charged will move towards that very low marginal cost. That'll leave nothing to cover the initial investment. So to get around that, what tended to happen in Victorian London and elsewhere, you divide up the city into non-competing districts. That happened in gas, it happened in water. But if you have non-competing districts, who on earth is going to ensure the quality of what is being supplied? What is the quality of the water being supplied to the consumer? And there were two possible solutions to that problem back in the Victorian period and now. One is to regulate the price charged to the consumer or to regulate the dividends. If we take gas companies in Victorian London, they had what was called a sliding scale. If the company charged more to the consumer, they had to reduce the dividend. So the argument there was the only way they could increase the dividend was to decrease the price to the consumer, which meant you had to be more efficient. You had to invest in better productivity. The argument there, that would then benefit everybody. So regulation of price or dividends was one thing which could be done. The other was a threat of public ownership. And I'd like to take you to 1848 and to the great liberal Victorian economist, John Stuart Mill. John Stuart Mill said that Britain had recently ended the old monopolies, the monopoly of the East India Company, for example, which charged a monopoly high price for tea from China. That had been swept away by reformers in the early 19th century. But he said, having ended old monopolies, we now have the danger of a new monopoly. He said, if a consumer didn't like the quality of the bread provided by a baker, she could go to another baker or indeed bake it at home. You could not do that with a gas retort. You couldn't set up your own. You were dependent on that natural monopoly. And he said, if you delegate management to a company, he said they're going to be exploitative, what he called jobbing, careless, and ineffective, compared with personal management by a baker or a candlestick maker. Companies have shareholders who do not have an immediate engagement with their customer, and therefore they're not concerned about their social reputation. Now, Mill did not like large bureaucracies. He thought they were corrupt, they were likely to be corrupt. But he said private companies were even worse. He said a government which concedes such monopoly, I have a quote there, unreservedly to a private company, does much the same thing as if it allowed an individual or an association to levy any tax they choose for their own benefit on all the malt produced in the country, on all the cotton imported into it. So it was like giving a taxing power for private gain. So he did not like private companies. You might be wondering here about Thames Water, of course. He saw private utility companies as a threat to a freely competitive market. He wanted a capitalist economy in which everybody competes. But he said these large private utilities, which were natural monopolies, destroy that. And in 1861, he referred to water in that second quote. He was referring there to the regulation of the London water supply. He said, the question is not between free trade and a government monopoly. The case is one in which a practical monopoly is unavoidable, and the possession of a monopoly by individuals constitutes not freedom, but slavery. It delivers over the public to the mercy of those individuals. So, in the case of natural monopolies, he said, public ownership might be the solution. So in the mid-Victorian period, these issues of regulation and ownership were being worked out for the first time. It's the first time you have these big companies. And one solution was indeed, as John Stuart Mill suggested, that the utilities were taken into municipal ownership, local ownership, as well as national ownership. Both Liberals and Conservatives were engaged in nationalising the telegraphs in 1870, telephones in 1912, and Mr. Gladstone had even suggested nationalising the railways back in the 1860s. They believed they were going to preserve free market capitalism from monopolies. Indeed, according to Joseph Chamberlain, the famous Lord Mayor of Birmingham in the 1870s, Birmingham City Corporation, in taking over these natural monopolies, was itself becoming like a giant joint stock company in which the citizens were the shareholders. And he said in 1892, the leading idea of the English system of municipal government is that of a joint stock or cooperative enterprise in which the dividends are received in the improved health and the increase in the comfort and happiness of the community. The members of the council are the directors of the great business, and their fees consist in the confidence, the consideration, and the gratitude of those amongst whom they live. So not private companies, but the council, like a joint stock company, dividends in benefiting the public. So this is what's being worked out then, first of all, how to deal with natural monopolies. The second concept I want to address is that of externalities. Now, if you pump sewage into a river, or if a chemical works pours toxic waste into rivers, they're not going to put that cost on to the public into their own balance sheet. They're externalising some of their costs. And a city emptying its sewers into a river, which kills fish, cattle downstream, or pollutes the water supply of the next town downriver, isn't actually itself having to take that account of that cost. There's a problem of free riding. A polluter doesn't pay for the costs that polluter imposes on the rest of society. And there's no point in one company acting not to pollute the river if nobody else does it. Why should you incur costs if others are free riding on what you do? So then you have a problem about how do you solve that problem of externalities and free riding. And then, as now, there were three ways of doing it. And the same thing applies to climate change and carbon emissions. One is to bargain. The owners of the polluting chemical works or sewage works might pay people downstream for the damage caused. Different property interests could negotiate with each other. A second possibility is to impose a tax. You put a tax on the polluter so that they are forced to internalise their cost. And a third option is to regulate. You set rules, the permitted level of discharge of sewers or toxic waste, and then if you go above that limit, then the polluter is fined by the local authority or the state. So that's the second concept. Third concept, which is what the introduction referred to, is the boundary between private and public, between collective action and private action. Now, large-scale investment has a very long time horizon. It's what I would call patient capital. It takes many years to cover the costs involved in the initial capital investment. Normally, private enterprise can't wait that long. It needs its return more quickly, except in a couple of circumstances. One circumstance is mania. People just take leave of their senses, which is what happened in the railway boom in the 1830s and 1840s. People just, like in the dot-com bubble, they poured money into the railways and they weren't going to get it back. They just thought they were onto a good thing. Outside of mania, the other approach is to award a franchise, that the public authority allows the company to operate with support, with backing from the government by providing subsidies, bailouts, a regulated market, so that over the long term they will get their money back on their patient capital. The government ensures a secure income stream over the long term, which will then allow the private company to borrow at a lower rate of interest. So, that means public support for private provision. So this, as we'll see, can happen in the Victorian period, but it really takes on a new form in the 1990s. Public-private partnerships or private finance initiatives. Private companies invest to build a road, a hospital, and that's made possible by providing a guaranteed revenue from the government. A public agency commissions a project from a special purpose vehicle, which then borrows and builds the project. The public authority then pays a fee to cover the loan charge, and pays for the use of the hospital, whatever it might be, for the life of the project. The private company is protected from liabilities. If the special purpose vehicle fails, the parent company can walk away. Now, it is true that public bodies can borrow on the money market more cheaply than a private body, but it was argued by the Treasury that the efficiency of the private sector means that they will be more efficient and therefore can cover the higher interest rates. And above all, it kept the investment off the public sector borrowing requirement. It was a way, if you like, manipulating, massaging the books. So that's another way you do it. You can franchise. So bear that in mind for the end of the lecture. But of course, the third option, which I've already been talking about, is public ownership. Why use the private sector at all? Why not, as John Stuart Mill argued, have public ownership? Public bodies can borrow at a lower interest rates. And indeed, as Joseph Chamberlain realised, if you take over the gas company into public ownership in Birmingham, you could actually make a profit, which could then be used to reduce the local taxes and to provide public benefit. If you go to the Birmingham Art Gallery, it says the Birmingham Art Gallery was paid for by the money made by the profit from the gas company. So it's going to raise the standard of education of Birmingham citizens. So that was an argument that is also possible. So these three concepts I've been talking about become apparent for the first time on a large scale in the second quarter of the 19th century, as Britain experienced industrialisation and urbanisation. By 1851, Britain was the first country in the world to have half of its population living in cities. And this was a situation that was talked about by most social reformers, from Frederick Engels to Charles Dickens. And here my quote from a French visitor to Manchester, Alexis de Tocqueville, who talked about the appalling sewage and pollution in the rivers there, the filthy sewer in Manchester from which pure gold flows. And we have a crisis of public health as a result of that. You see here the life expectancy at birth in England and Wales. In London, you would be dead by the age of 35, whereas if you lived in the countryside, you were dead by the age of 45. So you've got the problem here of public health, waterborne diseases in particular. In most cities like Manchester and London, sanitation was still provided by common privies and ash pits. Supply of water was limited, and even where there was a piped supply of water, it was intermittent. And the issues in London came to a head in the Great Stink of 1858. Now, why was there a Great Stink in 1858? Well, if we go back to the time when this college, Gresham College, was founded in the 16th century, there were 8 commissions of sewers for the city, North London and South London. Sewers meant surface water, drainage of rainwater. Sanitation was provided by cesspits and by night soil men who came and collected human waste. Those 8 commissions were merged into one Metropolitan Commission of Sewers in 1849. And that was then taken over by the Metropolitan Board of Works in 1856. And a problem is starting to arise. People start using, from the 1840s, water closets. and they start connecting the water closets to the sewers, which were not intended for that purpose. There's also a lack of money, because you would only pay a tax for the sewers if you had a connection to the sewer itself. So there's not a massive tax base to provide a better service. So more and more human effluent is going into the Thames, with more water closets and a lack of ability to invest in a better system. The outfalls are now polluting the Thames, as you see in this punch cartoon of what is happening there. In June 1858, the stench from the River Thames was so bad that the Commons was disrupted. MPs rushed from the chamber with handkerchiefs to their noses. The Times said that Parliament was all but compelled to legislate on the Great London nuisance by the force of sheer stench. But what to do about it? There was a Conservative government, and the Chancellor of the Exchequer was Benjamin Disraeli. He had to deal with this issue, and he moved a bill. He said that the Thames, he said, has really become a Stygian pool, reeking with ineffable and intolerable horrors. Well, Disraeli's bill passed in double quick time. So what was done? Now think about some of the concepts I was talking about earlier on. The construction of a new sewage system was the work of Joseph Bazalgette. It was one of the great achievements of the Victorian era. The Metropolitan Board of Works secured permission to build the new sewers in 1858. It was taken for granted by Disraeli that it should be a public responsibility. The only question, he said, was who would pay the taxes? So there was some suggestion it should be the whole country should pay, because London was the capital and it had Parliament in it, it had all the national institutions. But he said no, it should be self-government. It should be the local authority. But the Metropolitan Board of Works didn't have the resources. It didn't have the tax base to provide it. So Disraeli had to try and come up with a solution to that. And what he said should happen is that Parliament should impose a new sewage tax in London of 3 pence, 3 old pence in the pound, on all inhabitants of London, whether or not they had a connection to the sewer. And the money from that could only be used for the purpose of building a better sewage system. There was no right of appeal against paying the tax. And the tax would be levied for 40 years. The income would go to the Metropolitan Board of Works, but the Metropolitan Board of Works would then also be guaranteed by the government on any borrowing it then made of £3 million at 4%. So what's happening here is that the government is guaranteeing the public body to make the investment and is providing a tax base for it. He said the Metropolitan Board of Works would be about self-government. The Treasury was providing a guarantee, but was not likely to incur any charge because there was a tax base there. And he said the Metropolitan Board of Works would be, I quote, perfectly unshackled and untrammeled, allowed to carry out its plans without interference from the Treasury. So this scheme is a combination of financial prudence, paying off the debt by the tax. It was about being economical. It was raising private funds for public purpose, for patient capital. It was through collective action. And this great task was carried out by Joseph Bazalgette over the next few years by building the intercepting sewers across London. Here they are on the embankment, taking sewage to the pumping stations at the outfalls, pumping the sewage along these intersecting sewers. So this system was completed at a huge cost of £4.1 million, and it resolved the problem of the Great Stink. But there's a point here to take into account. London could pump the sewage out to sea. You couldn't do that if you were in Manchester or Birmingham, which were inland cities. They're going to be using rivers, which then comes up with this problem of the nuisances that I was talking about, the pollution of the rivers, and how do you deal with externalities. So this takes us into a question of statutory regulation. You have to try and regulate this discharge. So the Public Health Act of 1848 allowed local boards of health to be set up, but they were voluntary and they were somewhat lethargic in taking action. In 1865, a Royal Commission on Rivers Pollution Prevention was set up because so many rivers from these big cities were so seriously polluted. What they wanted to try and make sure was that people downstream were not complaining about the sewage put into the rivers, because if you stop that, it would affect the public health of the cities. So in a sense, they wanted to allow pollution and stop people from complaining about it, because that would mean that you would have problems of public health in the cities. The report of 1867 said the principal offenders in pollution are the large towns. They're very rarely prosecuted by private persons because the public bodies have got more capacity to fight court cases. So they said, what we need to do then is to regulate them. 1876, the River Pollution Prevention Act tried to regulate discharges. But there's a big problem here, inadequate power. There was no offence, it said, if the authority pumping sewage into the rivers, as I quote, was used in the best practicable and available means to render harmless the sewage matter. The question there, of course, is what is practicable? What is available? What is harmless? These are all terms which have to be defined in the courts, and that was not easy. They were not defined in the legislation. So the regulation is actually not easily achieved, and above all, the bodies which do the regulating are those who are doing the pollution as well. So the regulation is not going to be terribly effective. So regulation doesn't work very well. The alternative is to rely upon the courts, to rely upon nuisance law. And I've put one of the key court cases here on the board, Embury and Owen of 1851. Now, let me pick out two legal principles here. There were two different principles involved in the law of nuisances, in this externalities of pumping sewage into rivers. One is the doctrine of prior appropriation. Who was there first? The polluter or the person being affected by the pollution? And the second doctrine was natural flow. A user downstream had a right to water undiminished in quality. Now, judges have faced an issue of how to balance those two things against each other. Did the owner of land downstream from Birmingham or Manchester have a right to pure water, natural flow? But if the town was there first, didn't they have the right to discharge the sewers? So you have here an issue which has to be fought out in the courts, and this was one of the key cases in 1851. The right to have a stream of water flow in its natural state is an incident of the property in the land through which it passes. So downstream, you have a right to natural water. But it's not an absolutely exclusive right, but only subject to the right of other riparian proprietors to the reasonable enjoyment of it. What's reasonable enjoyment? And consequently, it is only for unreasonable and unauthorised use of this common benefit that any action will lie. Well, if you're confused, you have every right to be. What does it mean? So this is going to be fought out in the courts over the rest of the century. What is an unreasonable use that would prevent others from having a reasonable enjoyment of the water? The court also argued you could not take account of the balance of convenience. One person downstream might be affected in the use of the water. 500,000 people upstream might be affected if they were stopped from putting their sewage into the water. Didn't matter. He said it was the right of the one person was as great as the right of the whole city upstream. So let me give you one example of how this fought out, just very briefly. A man called Charles Adderley, who was an MP, lived downstream from Birmingham. In 1858, he said, "The enjoyment of my landed estate is being destroyed by the stench of Birmingham sewage." The case went on until 1896. And he was right. There was an awful stench. So he goes to court and gets an injunction to stop the Birmingham putting its sewage into the river. But the courts say, well, we'll suspend the injunction whilst Birmingham City tries to introduce reasonable means of clearing up the sewage. So what the courts are doing are using the nuisance law to force the city to take action. So you get this going back and forth. They also try to buy him off. If you remember what I said earlier on, you can regulate or you can buy off. But he wanted so much money that the city corporation told him to basically get lost. So this is why it keeps going back and forth all the time. So the courts say, well, yes, you do have a right to the natural flow, but we're not going to enforce injunction to force the city corporation to give you that natural flow. We'll give the city time to find a way around it. So this goes back and forth until Joe Chamberlain comes in, and he has a big ambitious scheme, and he solves it by building a new sewage system, taking the money from the gas company, remember? And also a better system of cleaning up the sewage. So this is all being fought out endlessly throughout this period. And it also continues into the 20th century, where more regulation is attempted to be introduced after the Second World War. 1848, river boards were introduced to try and look after the whole of the river system of pollution and water. The Act of 1851 gave more power to authorities, public authorities, to repair damage, to minimise future pollution. But even so, it doesn't go very far. There's still a standoff between the Ministry of Health, concerned about the impact of urban development upon water quality, and the desire to build more housing. So this is fought out, for example, building of the new town at Harlow. You need to build more towns, more housing. You need to have more industry to improve Britain's export potential after the war. And the government, in a standoff within the government, decides water quality or sewage quality, river quality, takes second weight to building the housing. 1863, the Water Resources Act replaces the river board set up in 1851 with 27 river authorities. They try to introduce permits to control discharges. So again, using regulation. And in 1874, they were in turn replaced by 10 regional water authorities in England and Wales. New bodies like Thames Water Authority try to integrate the sewage and the water supply. So this had been talked about back in the 1860s and is finally coming about, a central water planning authority. So sewers were always provided by public bodies until privatisation in 1989. Let me now turn quickly to water supply. So sewers are always public. What about water? The growing cities of the Industrial Revolution didn't really have adequate water supply. Very few towns had piped water. To take an example of Manchester in 1846, only 11,000 houses had a piped water supply. Another 13,000 houses had a shared tap in the street. And the remaining 23,000 houses relied upon shallow wells or streams, which were, of course, polluted by cesspits. So the issue arose, who is to supply the water in these towns? Public bodies or private bodies? Well, in most cases, like here in London, it was left to private enterprise. And it starts with Hugh Middleton, and here we have up in Islington the new River Head. It was piping in water from where? In Hertfordshire, the new river company was bringing this water in. It had royal support. One of the major shareholders was James I and then Charles I, who sold out his share in 1631. Other companies then came in, and they divided London up. Remember what I said about districting? They divided London up into different districts, and they drew their water from the Thames. Now, the problem was that some of the water was downstream from the sewer outlets. Some was upstream from the sewer outlets, which was, on the whole, a desirable thing. So you have non-competing districts or natural monopolies. The West Middlesex Company drew its water upstream. The Southwark and East London companies, this is a Southwark company, drew it from downstream. But there's also increasingly a public initiative. In Manchester, for example, the corporation secured powers in 1847 to take over the private company. It was transferred in 1851. It brought water in from the Peak District, piped in mainly to middle-class districts. By 1880, the inhabitants of Manchester were using 82 gallons of water a day, which is up from 12 gallons a day back in 1846 when I mentioned it. But there's still a problem that because of, remember I said it's an inland town, if you've got more water and people use water closets, it all goes into the streams, which caused the sort of problem I was talking about. So they decide in Manchester to still use night soil carts and pale closets so as not to pollute the rivers. So the sort of nuisance issue I was talking about means you have to be very, very careful about what you're doing. And then they invest massively in new reservoirs up in the Lake District, in Thirlmere. They pipe it in, again, huge expense involved here. And Birmingham, Joe Chamberlain, built reservoirs and dams in the middle of Wales, Elan Valley, to bring in water. So Thirlmere, Act of 1879, and in the case of Birmingham, Chamberlain announces in 1875, he says, the power of life and death should not be in the hands of a commercial company, but should be entrusted only to the representatives of the people. There's a certain resonance in what he says here. He went on, I think the supply of water should not be directly or indirectly dependent on the profits of a private association. So he bought the private water company and he embarked on this scheme of building reservoirs in mid-Wales in 1893, completed in 1906. So in 1860, just under 40% of the water companies, water utilities in Britain were publicly owned. By 1910, 62% publicly owned. That was undertakings, of course, since some of them were very big, it's likely to be a much higher proportion of the total water supply was in public hands. Why was this done? Just quickly, a number of reasons. One, these public authorities had access to cheap loans through the Public Loans Board, Public Works Loan Board, run by the government, but also borrowing on the money market. They had the security of taxing power. It was also hoped that reducing the price of water would give access to poorer residents, reduce the spread of disease, and have social benefits. Firefighting was another major point. Think about Los Angeles now. There's also what one historian has called liquid politics, consumer action. There's big pressure, and this happens in London in the late 19th century, from local citizens. They didn't like paying money to companies which is based upon taxation of their house. It wasn't a user charge, it was a tax power. So if it's a tax power on your local rates, why is it going to private bodies? It was also the way in which then extras were charged. If you had a bath, or if you watered your greenhouse, these were called non-domestic charges. A water closet was a non-domestic charge, which you had to pay extra. But over time, these didn't seem to be extras, they seemed to be essentials. People started saying, why are we paying these extras? The sense of what was cleanliness and comfort in the home shifted. So you have mass campaigns in the 1870s and 1880s in London. But it was only eventually in 1904 that the London water companies were taken over. Now, it's true there was some improvement before then. There was more regulation which tried to impose better water quality, but it wasn't really working to any extent. There's more and more pressure coming from the public to municipalise in London. The Metropolitan Board of Works tried to take over the water companies in 1878 and in 1886. The London County Council, which then replaced it, similarly tried to do that. But there was a problem. The London County Council is so big that other authorities nearby feared it would, gobble up all the water. It was too big. And the Conservative government didn't like the fact that the London County Council was controlled by radicals. So what eventually happens after a drought, which led to a serious water shortage in London, it was agreed to municipalise, but to make sure that the new Metropolitan Water Board was not controlled by the London County Council. It was made up of representatives of all the areas round about, with only limited representation from the London County Council. And there is their shield. The Metropolis Water Act of 1902 created a single-purpose Metropolitan Water Board, not under the control, like in Manchester and Birmingham, of the county council or the local council. It took over the supply in 1904, and for the first time, it provided water and sewage as an integrated system for the first time. Now, you might think that having happened in London, when Labour came to power nationally in 1945, it might nationalise the whole water system. Remember I talked about Water Act of 1951? They were already rationalising the river system. But it didn't happen. There was a split within the government between those who felt that nationalisation was the right thing to do and others who thought, let's not get into a fight with local authorities around the country. Let's concentrate on nationalising coal, for example, or steel more controversially. So a mixture of private and public services continued throughout. So you've got a large sector of public ownership, but also still private companies continued. Now, what is happening, though, of course, is that these improvements of water are leading to gains in public health. By 1911, life expectancy in London was 52. So it's gone up from 35. Infant mortality had dropped. So what I'm seeing here is a growing role for public investment and ownership. And of course, that was reversed in 1989 when water was privatised. The regulatory function of granting abstraction of water or discharges was passed to a new National Rivers Authority, which was in turn replaced by an under-resourced environmental agency in 1996, and the new privatised companies were regulated by the Office of Water Services, by Ofwat. What went wrong? Well, now we come to the world of privatisation. In 2001, Thames Water was bought by RWE, a German utility company. The Rheinische Westfälische Elektrik, I can't get my tongue around it, the Elektrikerwerk Aktiengesellschaft. Apologies to any German speakers in the room. Just as a sideline, that RWE, which was set up in the Ruhr Valley around Essen in 1898, was a different form of provision. It was a public-private joint enterprise. Local authorities owned part of the company, as did the Prussian state. It's not a solution you find in this country. But in 2006, this semi-private, semi-public organisation buys Thames Water. In 2006, they announced they're going to sell, and was bought by Kemble Water Holding, a consortium formed by the Australian-based Macquarie Group European Infrastructure Fund, which major shareholders included the Abu Dhabi Investment Authority and the Chinese Investment Corporation. It was based in Luxembourg, which allowed it to use a tax haven and to pay large dividends to the shareholders, unlike what we're talking about with Chamberlain. They then borrowed large sums against assets to increase dividends rather than to invest in the infrastructure. Now, of course, Macquarie itself denies neglect and says it invested more than either before or after it was involved. In 2017, it sold. And here are the shareholders in Thames Water. I declare interest. University superannuation scheme pays my pension. Rather a dead loss on the asset of the University Superannuation Fund, given what has happened. So you can see there who is owning this. Those holdings have been written down, and shareholders refused to provide more capital. The company had been borrowing very heavily, but was hit by rising costs of debt service and by failure to meet the regulatory standards of water and sewage. It announced it was in default on its debt. Now we're back to what I called liquid politics. Remember I said in the late 19th century there's consumer pressure. Well, again, we're seeing that this has become a very serious political issue, as it did before public ownership by the Metropolitan Water Board. Water bills have risen steeply since privatisation. There's a perception, whether or not you agree with it, of corporate greed with high dividends, a sense of poor service with leaks, failures of supply, not only in London but elsewhere around the country, environmental degradation with spills. Thames Water, for example, pumped 14.2 billion litres of sewage into the Thames in central London in 2023. Chris Whitty, another Gresham professor and head of the public health in this country, said that sewage pollution is a public health priority that had to be taken seriously. Polls find there is a majority support for nationalisation. And as I said at the beginning, contingency plans are being devised for in case of insolvency. The Environmental Secretary, Steve Reed, says people have a right to be angry, but of course, inevitably, he said, it was the fault of the last government. It was about irresponsible diversion of customers' money to bosses and to shareholders. And he said the problem is not going to go away. But he also said that he was not going to nationalise. He said that is off the table because it would cost billions and not solve the sewage crisis. Now, there has been one major investment which can help, and that is a supplement to the Bazalgette sewer, which had been built well over 100 years ago and was facing serious problems of lack of capacity. The scheme, which was originally called Bazalgette, then called Tideway, needed to build a new super sewer along the Thames, a new intersecting sewer like Bazalgette himself had built. And that new scheme was given parliamentary consent in 2014. A financial deal was awarded in 2015. It was going to cost, at the outset, £4.5 billion, diverting effluent from outflow pipes in central London to a treatment plant downstream. What I would like to conclude by is comparing how this Tideway, Bazalgette 2, was funded compared with Benjamin Disraeli in 1858. The approach here is public-private finance initiative. So, main features. First, it is not a public investment, as Disraeli had argued back in 1858. It's the responsibility of Thames Water, a private concern. That was not even considered in 1858. Ian Byatt, a former economic advisor to the Treasury and regulator of the water industry, pointed out, and I quote, "It should have been financed directly by government borrowing, which would have been much cheaper than special project finance." He pointed out that governments can borrow cheaper than anyone. But the Treasury argued that public responsibility would be poor value. In other words, private sector would be more efficient than a public body. It argued against the National Audit Office, which said that a private sector solution would be poor value for the taxpayer. Treasury disagreed. And of course, one point was that it kept the cost off the public balance sheet. But thirdly, neither was it funded from the balance sheet of Thames Water, which does not own Tideway. It set up a new company, which is currently owned by a mixture of different companies like Allianz Insurance Company, Swiss Life, Dalmore. That company would own, finance and deliver, that's the phrase, the sewer, and then supply sewage services to Thames Water on a 125-year concession. That was guaranteed by the government. Now notice in 1858, the government guaranteed the local authority borrowing money at cheap interest rates and not expecting actually to have to provide any support because it knew that the Metropolitan Board of Works had the wherewithal to repay. So in 1858, the Treasury allowed the public sector to borrow cheaply. Now it's underwriting the risk of private investors. And the whole cost will be covered by a surcharge on bills. And it could be argued by some that they were paying over the odds. So the role of the government is to act as an insurer of the private project, bearing the brunt of any cost overruns. In other words, the role of the state is to take on the risk of the private sector and not, as in 1858, to assist the public sector in securing public funds on good terms. Of course, Thames Water argues that the approach is the virtue of, I quote, balancing the interests of customers, investors and taxpayers. Well, one might have a different view on that. An alternative way of looking at the deal is that taxpayers and customers are providing guarantees against the risk of cost overrun, accidents and financial risks. Costs borne by the consumers, state covers the risks and the benefits are taken by financiers. So, in conclusion, the comparison between 1858 and 2015 brings out some major changes in the relationship between the state and the market over that period. First, the state ceased to provide infrastructure on any scale. In the past, in the Victorian period onwards, the state provided patience capital. Public sector net investment continued to rise after the war, from 2% of GDP in 1949 to a peak of 6% in 1969. Now it's fallen. By 1999, it was only 0.6% of the GDP. So public investment has absolutely slumped. But more than that, also selling off existing stock. Public sector net worth as a percentage of gross domestic product was 42% in 1970. It was down to 15% in 2000. So there's been a massive change here. Well, I perhaps could leave you with this thought. Perhaps the Victorians got it right. The Victorians are usually seen as great supporters of private capital, the age of, if you like, capitalism red in tooth and claw. But it wasn't. What they wanted to make sure was that natural monopolies did not exploit the public. Thank you.